Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Julie Beagle. I'm with the Army Corps of Engineers in the San Francisco district, and I'm so honored to get to open this exciting 2 days. As Caitlin said, we can all get in. First of all, it's so fun to be in person. I just want to say that. Sorry for everyone that I hugged, but it's really nice to see everybody. And I'm excited to hear from this room of experts, of people who have been advancing this field. How do we advance the science and the practice of the exact edge where people meet the baylands? I'll try to give a little context for this, sprinkle in some of the concepts, and then turn this over to our incredible panel. So I think it's important to start with the fact that our relationship with the upland wetland edge has always been shifting. 15,000 years ago, the wetland upland edge, or the shoreline, was all the way out at the Farallones. And as the estuary formed and the seas rose the last time, wetlands developed and the edge of wet and dry shifted, and people shifted with it. And that's very important because that led us to kind of where we are today with where the estuary as we know it today. So over recent millennia, sea levels have been relatively stable, as you all know, and we've had a different, more static, maybe more destructive relationship with the wetland upland transition zone. So this was the zone where indigenous communities created paths, trails, shell mounds, villages, where cities and counties built their infrastructure, roads, wastewater treatment plants. It's where areas were filled and where communities through redlining were forced to live in these areas that flood from the ground up a lot of times. Ecologically, as Caitlin said, it's the edge of what got wet on a really high tide or on a storm. So plant communities vary along the salinity and soil gradient. It's the areas where tidal marsh species seek high tide refuge on a high tide, and where terrestrial species seek resources, food, cover, and often these areas support really high biodiversity, like seasonal wetlands or vernal pools, and where creeks meet the baylands, delivering fresh water, sediment, nutrients. So really complicated area. I want to shout out to the Bayland Goals process that the Coastal Conservancy led with all of us. We learned about the concept of the complete marsh, that a marsh has a front edge to tidal marshes, to mud flats, to the shallows, to the subtidal, and on the back edge, it transitions, this upland transition zone to the uplands. And that heterogeneity within the marsh is also really important too. We'll hear a lot about that from Gavin later. So the term ecotone is often used to describe that transition between habitat types. But we all acknowledge, and this is why we're all here today, that sea level rise and climate change forces our perspective to shift again. Now we need to either recreate that wetland upland transition zone. We can use horizontal levees, features that tie into traditional levees but grade down to marsh elevation. We can focus on creating that space that we lost by reconnecting creeks to baylands through floodplain expansion. We have a lot of great examples in the room, experts here who have implemented lots of lessons learned. We also need to preserve what is left. In the rare places around our region that still support natural wetland upland transition zones, for the marsh migration space they afford, for the flood risk reduction for communities they achieve if we let them, if we keep them there. And we also must discuss moving or raising infrastructure to create that space while also using the natural function of tidal marshes to help buffer the effects of sea level rise with and for communities. So all this can be done at multiple scales. I don't know if Katie Smith is in the room. I've never met her in person, but I remember seeing Katie's photos of drowned salt marsh harvest mice that were blocked on Twitter because they were so graphic. So that's what our future holds if we don't find ways to implement transition zones around and within marshes and also create spaces for marshes to migrate. But can we see this as this grand opportunity? I think that's why we're all here, because we have hope that we can do this. This is the area where people are most likely to engage with tidal marshes, as they have for millennia. How can we enhance that? How can we reintegrate our cities with the shoreline, allow wildlife and people to equitably adapt to climate change together? That's our challenge. So we have this panel of folks who have expertise in this exact topic. We have a whole room of people with expertise in this exact topic. How do we engage communities, make this about designing with and for communities, build natural infrastructure? How do we fund it? How do we permit it? I'm going to turn it over to our panel now, hopefully, to continue the conversation. So Juliana Gonzalez has been the executive director of the Watershed Project for almost a decade. During that time, she has led multiple community-based planning and visioning processes that ensure community participation in the planning, implementation, and monitoring of shoreline adaptation and other climate resiliency projects in the Bay Area. Phoenix Armenta was meant to be here, but unfortunately cannot be here today. Amy Hutzel is the executive officer at the State Coastal Conservancy. She's been engaged in wetland restoration in San Francisco Bay for almost 2 decades, over 2 decades. Sorry.
I'm old.
Yeah, no. Ellen Blake serves as the Assistant Water Division Director and Manager of the Surface Water Branch at Region 9 in the Environmental Protection Agency. So each panelist is going to give their opening remarks for about 5 minutes, and then we'll get into questions from both us and from the audience and have a great discussion. So please take it away.
Okay, no, thank you. I think that I'm gonna have to expand a little bit my topic to cover some of the things that Phoenix was supposed to cover today, but I wanna just to start saying that it is such a great honor to be here and to be invited to be part of the discussions as we have been at the Watershed Project working on watershed awareness and education for 26 years now, but for the last 10 years, we really have tried to deepen our connections to the community and start really thinking about community engaging from different perspectives to ensure that we're really listening to the community, that we're really addressing multi-benefit needs and designing multi-benefit projects with the community and kind of opening those spaces and building capacity. So at the Watershed Project, we have started kind of thinking about the different stages of a project and the role that community engagement, awareness, education, and participatory design can play in building more resiliency around the San Francisco Bay. So when we talk about awareness and environmental education, we're always thinking about kind of how to make that engaging and kind of hands-on education, K-12 education, but also as we move into kind of trying to dream a project, then we have a planning process in which we are thinking about how the community can be part of that visioning. And so those type of exercises, we have implemented many different methodologies. And the truth is that they are an art and a science. So we have integrated art and sciences into trying to bring the community to the visioning, to imagining what is possible, and also trying to meet the community needs from the point of view of the quality of life of the neighborhood and the neighbors of a project, and how it overlaps with the objectives of a restoration or kind of risk mitigation project. So that point of view has kind of shifted how we engage the community. So we have created advisory boards and focus groups, and also of course, general surveys and participatory surveys and visual surveys. And that has helped us kind of come up with general visions of what the shoreline could look like for the North Richmond shoreline, where we have been doing an in-depth analysis. But after that was the case, then we had the opportunity of starting to actually plan a project. And for that, we got a chance of being part of the design team. So the CBO, the NGO, is one of the designers, and we bring the community to the table. To do that, we have to do some training and workshops and scaffolding so that their participation can be meaningful to the designers and to the engineers that are trying to weigh the different options. And also that way they can integrate the community perspective into the design process. After the project is designed, we hope that some of the cultural resources, the storytelling, and kind of community experiences can be integrated into the interpretation, the activation, and at the end of the project, of course, we have to do maintenance and operations and monitoring. And so we hope that there will be pathways of workforce development that start creating local wealth so that we invest in people as well as in infrastructure. So that's kind of the summary of what I wanted to say. Of course, we have used best practices. We pay people for their time. We work with tribal partners to ensure that we are creating projects that are mutually beneficial. We work with stakeholders to ensure that we are interpreting for our community group what the different stakeholders may have as constraints as they come into the project. And we advocate for that common good. So try to stay kind of impartial to the process of each of the stakeholders. And in our relationship with the tribal partners, we have found that kind of getting engaged in projects that are related to restoring cultural resources, kind of preserving the language, and creating kind of artistic endeavors has been a great way for us to start a relationship early, and then we can ensure that we have their attention when we are ready for a participatory design process. So with that.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm Amy Hutzel with the Coastal Conservancy. I just wanted to start off by thanking Evan Sloan at the Coastal Conservancy for all the work that went into this, and also thanking Will for getting this panel organized and the work that went into the workshop. I want to thank Save the Bay, San Francisco Estuary Partnership, and I guess I can thank the Coastal Conservancy even when I'm with it, for pulling this together, because I think it's a really important issue, this transition zone at the top of the tidal marshes around San Francisco Bay. So hopefully my comments aren't going to sound too repetitive. Julie did a great job introducing this. You know, we're dealing with sea level rise in San Francisco Bay, around the world, a very difficult issue, huge number of impacts, and impacts for our tidal wetlands. So these marsh migration spaces are one of the tools that we can use to address sea level rise in terms of protecting tidal wetlands and keeping them into the future. And I think I've talked about kind of three legs of the stool in terms of our work restoring wetlands in San Francisco Bay, and it really comes down to a sediment, and having, you know, the sediment we need either through natural sources or bringing in sediment, the funding for these projects, and the permits to actually do the project. So I'll try to touch on those three. I would just add a fourth that I think is important for this work, is the regional planning efforts that we do, and really having scientists and managers and community members, tribes, nonprofits, sitting together and thinking through, you know, what are the priorities for San Francisco Bay, and the methods that we can use to restore wetlands. So I love this, the complete wetlands. And I think this transition zone at the top of the marshes might be the most difficult part of the complete wetlands. We're bumping up against development and infrastructure. We're dealing with sea level rise. It's kind of a crunch zone, and very challenging to address. And in terms of having migration space for our wetlands, it's also expensive. You know, trying to allow the wetlands to migrate up and in, currently the land values to allow that are very high. I want to thank everybody who took part in the Baylands Goals update. I think we're almost coming on 10 years, which is amazing to think about that. I won't suggest doing another update. But that was a really important update to the original 1999 Baylands Goals report. And, I think the point of that update was really thinking about, can we achieve these goals in the face of sea level rise and other climate change impacts? And, I think it was a positive outcome from that in terms of, yes, we can achieve those goals, but we've got to do a lot of stuff and we've got to do it, relatively soon. So things like, increasing the pace and scale of restoration, getting as much vegetated marsh restored by 2030, which is really just around the corner, and a lot of goals and objectives related to this transition zone. So conserving the existing transition zones, creating horizontal levees or ecotones, or there's so many words for this, and creating an assessment program for transition zones. So hopefully today we can, and tomorrow, kind of revisit some of these objectives from the goals report. Are these, still the most important things we need to be doing, and look at how we're doing to accomplish them. And it is challenging. And I mean, I'm an optimist. I'm hopeful. This is a challenging issue for us to be facing, and yeah, we've got limited time to really address these issues. In terms of funding, I think we're in pretty good shape, and maybe we can get into that a little bit later with the questions. There are multiple sources of funding for this work: the regional Measure AA funding, state funding, federal funding, EPA funding. And we're learning from what we've done already. So, Sonoma Baylands was an early restoration project in San Francisco Bay using dredge sediment. We learned a lot from that. And I like to think we incorporated that into the work at the Hamilton restoration project. And I think Hamilton was kind of ahead of its time in terms of creating that transition zone along the levee. We're working on the shoreline project in the South Bay. Many challenges with making that project happen, but we're trying to incorporate ecotone into the construction of the levee and the wetlands restoration of the salt ponds. And I think I'll leave it at that. I was going to talk about some of the regulatory stuff, but I think we could talk about that during the question.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So thanks so much for having me again. I'm Ellen Blake, Assistant Director at EPA Region 9. And in my program are all of the Clean Water Act regulatory programs. So I have the benefit of being able to work on our 402 permitting program, which is EPA's permitting program, in addition to partnering with the Corps around 404, and then also the water quality standards and assessment. So it's nice to have that all in one branch. And I get to work on all different aspects of our Clean Water Act and use the best tool to deal with the problems that we have that we're facing. So thanks so much for having me. It's a great way to start the week here, coming together. I too am optimistic. Especially when I look around and I see all of the energy and excitement around doing this work in San Francisco Bay. It's a really great time right now to be at EPA, especially here in the Pacific Southwest. Because of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we are hopefully going to be accelerating progress towards meeting some of our climate change goals. So that's huge. And I don't want to lose track of that. We are investing in EPA money and resources in water infrastructure and technical assistance to the tune of almost $1 billion in California last year. That includes about $24 million for the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund. And it's still just a drop in the bucket for how much we actually need to get all of the work done. but we're excited that we can continue to bring resources to the table and hope those resources will continue to increase, especially for the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund and our geographic program. So on the ground at Region 9, we are using a holistic approach as we look at the funding and technical assistance. And we really want to build community-centered, climate resilient water programs. And so really pulling both that community focus into our climate change work across the board will be really important and is really important for us at Region 9. So we've worked with partners many years here around San Francisco Bay to support the protection and restoration of San Francisco Bay. As I mentioned, that support has grown significantly, and my fingers are crossed that it will continue to grow in the future. We have to focus on both wetlands and communities. Restored wetlands in San Francisco Bay are really our first line of defense against the sea level rise, the groundwater rise, and the localized flooding that are going to be impacting our local communities. And those are typically our underserved communities that haven't had a voice. And so starting to focus on that, bringing those voices into the conversation will be really, really important. Those rising seas, one of the things that I do work with is our wastewater treatment plants. And so those rising seas are putting some really important infrastructure, including roads, hospitals, and wastewater treatment plants at risk. And so it is imperative that we start to move quicker than we have in the past. So with all of you, we're working on that consensus-based goal of restoring 100,000 acres of wetlands. For shoreline and coastal wetlands, resilient protection requires an emphasis on nature-based solutions. And we have to be able to incorporate wetland migration. We know our landscape is going to be changing. I think Evan gave us a really good example. Julie gave us a really great example as we were starting of where we've been over the millennia of San Francisco Bay. So we know it's going to be changing, and we have to give nature the space to adapt to those changes so that we can continue to grow and thrive here in San Francisco Bay. So from my perspective as a regulator and a funder, in order to implement these nature-based solutions, we need collaboration, we need regional guidance, and we need focused coordination around some regulatory initiatives. There are some great ones that are already underway. The Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, so the BRIT team, as well as the long-term management strategy for dredge sediment in the Bay. Those have been successful in the past, and I'm looking forward to updating them and moving them forward in the future to help address the problems that we have. So we've made some really important progress. I'm interested in learning from some of those successes and failures. With Juliana, I was interested to hear some of the work that you guys are doing around in the Richmond area. So it's really critical that we do continue to come together, not just at presentations and discussions and have questions, but also those side conversations I think are really important. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to see where the next couple of days takes us.
Great. Thank you. Great introductions. So I'm going to start with Juliana, because I think we've all kind of have this consensus around the importance of grounding this in communities, especially communities who have been underserved. So can we talk a little bit more about how many folks in this room are project planners? They're doing projects on the ground. Can you talk about what your organization has been doing in Richmond that might help us all think about how project planners can better include communities and tribes? What are some best practices?
Yeah, so we have been working, the Watershed Project works mostly in the East Bay, also in San Francisco, but we decided about 10 years ago that we were going to choose an area as kind of like our case study area where we'll like try different techniques and kind of go deeper in our relationships in the community. And so like not only be the NGO, but also the CBO in a way. So deepening those relationships was really important to be able to lay the foundation for the work that we're able to do today. We work really closely with the city of Richmond, with Contra Costa County unincorporated kind of governance, and with many of the stakeholders that work not only in restoration, but also have land along potential open spaces, such as the North Richmond shoreline. The North Richmond shoreline was one called the forgotten shoreline. Industrial, like a landfill, wastewater treatment facility, and some of that infrastructure that today we feel is at risk from sea level rise. And when we started working in the area, we were also working in two creeks that drain to the bay there, the Wildcat and the San Pablo Creek, that happen to be open creeks for the majority of their length. So it provides a lot of opportunities for people to have these spaces in their consciousness. So when we chose that as our case study area, we kind of were really like trying to understand what were the community needs. We had the opportunity to work with SFEP in initial visioning, trying to kind of like get community preferences and like kind of like a very traditional approach to kind of shoreline use, like a recreational survey almost. And then we started to incorporate other community needs into our approach to trying to see how can we find the link between today's needs and priorities for the community and the neighborhood, and this future planning that is sometimes so difficult for people to just kind of grasp and say, I really want to prioritize an investment for my grandkids, even thought like I may not be here because I'm a renter, and like people are not necessarily thinking that way. And so we were like, okay, let's just kind of like start thinking about kind of more holistic planning. At the time, the Resilient by Design competition 2017 said like, we want to have a couple areas, and we suggested the North Richmond area, and we were matched with the home team. So that brought kind of that perspective of how could it look like in 100 years? So that really kind of like put things in perspective for a lot of people, beautiful visuals and kind of that long-term planning. But it incorporated multiple things. It had the infrastructure, the transportation, and the housing. It was the home team because the emphasis was on housing. So that really kind of brought it home for the community. And it gave us kind of another opportunity of do a different type of community engagement. In that case, we chose an advisory board. So we invited a couple of members of the community that we have met over the years with our projects and say, why don't you come and help us dream the future? And then that group helped us design a survey that could be kind of provided to the rest of the community in a traditional survey again to get some feedback. What we learned from that is that traditional surveys are really limiting. It's difficult to really kind of understand who is saying what, like, so they were a good tool for a visioning. But as we went a little deeper, we had another opportunity of like now asking the community to tell us more about stormwater and sea level rise. And we said, well, now we're going to do a more in-depth like dive and invite the community to have a couple of days with us and do a workshop. So it was a water needs assessment with Kerwin. We're like, okay, we will do workshops. We'll pay the community members to come and sit with us and learn about the topic. And then we'll ask them for their opinion about that particular topic. So then it was a learning session with a little academy. And then we'll have kind of this kind of focus group, you will call it. We didn't go to the entire community, but we tried to bring a lot of people to those workshops. Of course, the community was paid for their time. We provided food and also like childcare and all the best practices that we kind of have all understood that are like a must. But then we said, you know what? Now we have this other opportunity to start thinking about a shoreline adaptation project. So we partnered with SFEP with a little grant from a foundation. I mean, $50,000 can do a lot of good. And for like a couple of years, we started to talk to stakeholders and say, okay, can we work in a kind of a governance model that can have some community input and have this kind of workforce slash also kind of like planning stakeholder group. And so the stakeholders were interested, many of them had land or opportunities for improving the shoreline. And we were tasked with helping fundraise. So we were part of the fundraising effort. And by doing so, we were able to write the community engagement as a more robust component of the process. And when the fund was granted, it was granted to the wastewater treatment facility, Joe is here. And they were really visionaries in that when they were selecting the design team, they favored the design team that was partnering with the CBO, with the nonprofit, so that the community engagement was not an add-on, it was going to be part of the design. And so that for us was an opportunity. We then moved from saying, okay, we're not just going to educate the public about the project. The project is coming one day, but more like, let's recruit community members to be part of like this learning group. We had a long academy that was a learning session with the designers and the engineers, kind of telling us what was possible. The community members were part of the design team, and also they designed the survey for specific things, now very like kind of like control of what was possible for the project. Now we move to, of course, the implementation phase. And in the city of Richmond, we have had a lot of success with sole source contracting. We're going to implement a little project in the Rim Creek watershed neighboring, and multi-million-dollar project. And a big chunk of the project is implemented with community members that are hired by the nonprofit or the CDL. And we propagate some of the plants, we do some of the planting, we do all the outreach with the community to develop maps, to do surveys. And that type of like in-depth relationship really kind of carries the investment and also brings like the needs of the community today, which often we hear is they want employment for the youth, and they want kind of investment in safety and other things that are like impacting their lives today, and then needing kind of this planning for the future. And just last one thing was like, you asked me about the community engagement with the tribal partners and kind of with the community at large. We find that like the interpretation and the education around the project is best done when you are bringing art and creative placemaking into that. And also when you're like trying to bring the stories from our tribal partners, like oral history, language, and just kind of like their community needs and what they're trying to do within like their like particular group into the fold, so that you're serving always multiple benefits. So that was long. Sorry.
That was incredible. I have so many follow-up questions. I'm wondering, Amy and Ellen, listening to that kind of incredible, thorough, and thoughtful response, how do you think, as you know, you both talked about the amount of funding that we have now, and what Juliana was saying made me think it's about how we like being able to pay people for their time and engagement. And how do you think about that when you are funding regional efforts or even larger efforts? How do you integrate these lessons learned into the way you're thinking about funding?
One thing that popped out at me that she said was that $50,000 is a lot of money.
Yeah.
It can go a long way, and that's really good to hear, because a lot of times I think we have a lot of smaller grant programs that aren't these big, huge, billion-dollar infrastructure programs, and learning about ways to do exactly that. Of how do you bring in a community into the decision making and make them feel part of the decision when there's not a decision yet to be made, right? But how do you engage them in that planning effort? And hearing that small amounts of money can be helpful in doing that. We have small money. We have, we have a harder time, I think, with the larger amounts of money. There are more restrictions on it. So I was happy to hear that. It's getting me to think a little bit creatively about, I'm looking at my team here, some of the smaller pots of money that we have, of how do we make sure that money is getting out to these places in the community to do exactly that, to pay people to pay for childcare so that they can attend these meetings. That was one of my questions when you were first talking of a multi-day planning meeting, is how are you creating space for them to be able to come and be able to engage? Because we're fortunate that we're all getting paid to be here now, right? So how do we do that for the community? So
yeah, and I should clarify, I mean, the $50,000 go a long way in that initial stance. It was like, what allow us to play the first day, but then every step has had a different type of engagement. When we did a 9 months of engagement, we were using Zoom, so that kind of facilitated a lot of like those meetings. People were being paid, of course, for their time, but we were, like in some cases when we have like a full day or a half day workshop, we are just kind of matching it with something that is a community like need. So if like maybe like we say, okay, let's have the children have a puppet show about the creek, and at the same time, then we have the parents come and do this workshop with us, or we are doing something that is for the entire family. So it is possible to, you have to just think about what is it that you're trying to get from that kind of event. So if you're just trying to get a community opinion about a very particular thing, you may use a different methodology than if you're planning a very long 5-mile project where you're trying to get them to basically start thinking about a little bit the city planning, and at the same time about like what was in my quality of life plan and the priorities that we heard from the community saying what we really need is more places for kids to play safely. Or we want, we're concerned about a pollutant that may be coming from a particular parcel that is affecting and impacting their quality of life. Or we're concerned about like an environmental, like I don't know, maybe trash that like is in our creek and at the same time is getting to the shoreline and it doesn't allow us to access it. So like oftentimes, or like our like population is obese and we want to have like alternatives for healthy living and more trees because it's too hot. And so like you have to kind of just think about what is it that they are going to get out of it in their learning, and also what is the contribution that you want from them without, I mean, they're experts in their neighborhood, but they may not be experts in like, I don't know, transition zone. What does it mean? So like, it's just kind of trying to find those spaces could be very expensive if you do it for 9 months, but it could also be different things at different times, I think. But my biggest takeaway from my experience is that you need to plan for the entire project. And at each stage of the project, you have a different type of tools that you can use for really getting community engagement and actually listening to the community, not just capturing their voices, but bringing them to the design table, which is the difficult part. And I think that changing the regulations will help, because it's very difficult for an agency to say, I'm going to have an RFP that has a CBO as one of the designers. I mean, they're happy to hire an engineer and a design firm, but the CBO is not part of the team. And when you say, I'm going to build it, you hire an engineering firm, but you don't put it in your like the regulatory requirements from the EPA, or like say like, oh no, you have to hire a biologist that does this in this procedure. And I'm like, why? I mean, community members can be trained to count plants and take water quality monitoring samples and have a job next to the scientist. So it's those opportunities that I find will break some of those barriers like around the bay. And then workforce development for maintenance and operations. My goodness, all of this investment will go really like, it will be a nightmare if we don't plan for who is going to maintain and who is going to propagate all the plants that we will need for the millions of dollars that we want to invest.
Yeah. Amy, what do you think about that for kind of, I think
Yeah.
the Coastal Conservancy has made a lot of progress on this.
Yeah, and I would say, there's this is the right way to do these projects. Like if you're thinking about how best to go about this, engaging community, engaging tribes, that is what we should be doing. But I think also thinking about how a project is actually going to be successful and get implemented. If you're just thinking about it from that perspective, it's also the right thing to do. I mean, at the state level, tribal consultation has become incredibly important. There's a couple executive orders from the governor. There are requirements in CEQA. We've got to be showing early, often and meaningful engagement with tribes in order to do projects. And in terms of community engagement, I mean, BCDC now has, environmental justice policies. So you've got to show that you've done this to get your BCDC permit. And I think just generally, it's a small percentage of the overall budget, but it's going to hopefully pay off in the end in terms of having the support to move these projects forward. It's amazing that we've actually been able to do some of the projects we have around San Francisco Bay. I mean, thinking about all the hurdles throughout a project, I just, think about Hamilton, and now it exists. It is there. It is doing, remarkably well and is an asset for people and for wildlife. But getting to that point is very hard. So having as much support as possible among, a wide variety of constituents is really important to get the funding for the project and get the permits and be able to implement it. And hopefully great ideas are coming out of the planning process that are influencing how we design these projects.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about permitting.
Oh, yeah.
So from all three of your perspectives and the federal, state, local level, what are the key challenges you see in the permitting process for getting these projects?
Yeah,
Amy, you to go.
Yeah, I could dive in. I mean, I think we've been making some progress, and I think Julie mentioned the BRIT, the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, and I really want to thank Sarai is here. She's been a huge part of making the BRIT happen. So I think we're making strides in terms of coordination among the state and federal regulatory and resource agencies on wetlands restoration projects. I think that coordination is really important, and addressing some of the policy issues. And in terms of this, and Louisa's out there too. Oh my gosh, yeah, mother of the Brit there. Sorry, I got off track there. But in terms of some of the specific issues with regulation and the work we're doing in this transition zone, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to fill and that, waters of the state, waters of the United States, and are we having a net loss of waters as part of our project. So really, can we get to a point where we're thinking about this, if we're filling either in an existing wetland or in a salt pond, that is waters of the state, if we are filling some amount in order to allow for this transition zone, can we think about the long term instead of just looking at, well, we're losing, 50 acres of waters to put in the fill, and we need to go and then mitigate for that, which when you're doing a restoration project, it's a little hard to wrap your mind around having to mitigate for your restoration. So I think that is, that's probably the most critical regulatory issue.
Yeah, and maybe mine is just a different lens on the same issue, which is we just need to get out of our own way. I think our permitting regulations give us a lot of discretion, and we are not comfortable in using that discretion. We are used to permitting development projects, not restoration projects. And I think we're always thinking of the worst case scenario. I'm working on a similar initiative with our 402 program, our NIPDES program, through the Water Reuse Action Plan, right? And it is, how do we change what we've been doing for the last, 40 pretty successful years of the Clean Water Act, and how we've been permitting these, and start to shift and be uncomfortable with risk. We're gonna probably make some people upset with some of the permitting decisions that we're making. And we have to be okay that we are still making science-based, decisions that are based in our regulations and then deal with those challenges. Because at the point that we stop making the decisions to do it, it's as if we decided not to permit that project. And so I think really starting to look at that ways that we can innovate using our existing authorities will be really important. Hopefully, we're doing such a good job building consensus and bringing communities along with us that we aren't going to have those challenges. That's the other big hurdle in front of us, is bringing communities and community members along with us so that they understand the benefits of what we're doing. But I think that for me is, it's not a regulation change, getting comfortable with risk and understanding that we are dealing with a different paradigm now than we have been in the past.
Yeah, I have to add to that because that was so terrific. And I think it's that, yeah, it is challenging because we have decades and decades of laws and regulations set up to protect these resources. And we really value those laws and regulations. It's why we have, the wetlands that we do have remaining around San Francisco Bay. But we are in a different situation now in terms of climate change, sea level rise, and learning to accept more risk and thinking about the long-term benefits of the projects and the the trade-offs that we're making right now with these projects. And earlier I had talked about, this transition zone perhaps being the hardest part of the restoration sphere, but at the subtidal end, the intertidal, we're kind of dealing with similar regulatory issues around our oyster and eelgrass restoration, and just some the word fear is perhaps too strong, but just concerns about the risks we're taking, experimenting with oyster eelgrass restoration or other, subtidal, intertidal restoration. And, perhaps some of these are not going to be successful. But if we're not experimenting, if we're not trying things out and monitoring them and seeing what's working, we're not going to get there in terms of sea level rise resilience for our wetlands and for our communities.
Yeah, I guess at the local level, what we have seen is like what I was mentioning, that a lot of times the regulation is kind of precluding the community members to participate in a meaningful way because the agencies feel that they can only spend their dollars in a certain way. So only the element that is the green element got funded, the active transportation element didn't. And that was what the community had said was the co-benefit they wanted from the project. So then that piece gets pushed, and then the community doesn't have much to say about what type of science you need to use. However, that's not true. I mean, like, we could also modify those rules and kind of have more community scientists and kind of bring more people from the community to participate also in the science. So that's another like piece that for me was always surprising. I mean, I saw how Costa Rica did it as a country and they just trained a bunch of people in like parabotany and like extracting DNA. I mean, it was like the best person in the lab. I worked many, many years ago. Extracting DNA was the lady that before was serving the coffee. So, I mean, it was just like, I was like, there is like a little bit of like these barriers that we create for ourselves as of like how we can do things. And I think that like this piece of like kind of the natural restoration and the science of it is separated from the people that are going to benefit from it. And we try to build consensus on things that people don't necessarily know how to grasp. And so that has been kind of an interesting thing about the regulatory constraint. And then the other one is the contracting. Contracting has very strict like regulations. And I was challenging some people saying like, you know what, why don't we have every project have a sandbox? You know, Salesforce here, they have sandbox for their, for like people to kind of try things out. Why don't we have a sandbox for every project where like the community can come and try different things, and like the CBOs can bring people and the students can like do some of the restoration, and we're not so constrained by all the regulations, so that we can have a little bit of that experimentation that we need to learn the best management practices and the best practices. And also we have to raise the capacity of the CBOs and the NGOs to be able to do this, because the Watershed Project has invested a lot of time in building our own capacity and training our own staff and hiring staff. And so we have done it in a very deliberate way, but it will take that for many of us.
Yeah, I want to channel Phoenix, who couldn't be here unfortunately, who's led the Shoreline Leadership Academy. Marin City through Resilient by Design also had this great sort of capacity building approach. And then like we were talking about earlier, who we hire, how hiring practices can be expanded, internship programs, and sort of just, it has to happen at all levels. Both.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that the academy idea is excellent. I think that we can have many academies to start training young people. Like a lot of nonprofits have green teams and have like green corps and those models, but we don't have them funded to do the meaningful work. So that's another thing about community engagement. I find that if what they're doing is not really meaningful and it's not going to actually result in some decision or some improvement, people just kind of say like, okay, whatever. You're talking to me about something that really never going to happen, or a project that is too far in the future. If you don't have kind of other smaller steps that you're taking to keep the community engagement going and have kind of multiple feedback loops, then you lose their attention. And that means we have to be at different stages of the process, reducing some of the regulatory constraints.
Right, thank you. So this is, you all alluded to this. A lot of people in this room are ecologists, wetland restoration specialists, but the transition zone, the marsh migration space, that's where all our infrastructure is. So Joe from Contra Costa, you know, Highway 37, how do we bring in transportation, Caltrans, the Federal Highway Administration? What's the strategy for all of the other big players who need to be in these conversations? And what successes have you seen? Because I think there are some good ones.
You want to start?
Oh, boy. Okay. Well, thanks to the agencies who have infrastructure right around San Francisco Bay who are engaging in this work. And it's not happening everywhere around San Francisco Bay. So in those cases where it is, it's very much welcome. And yeah, I think our wastewater treatment plants, our freeways, highways, these are, you know, really critical pieces of infrastructure to keep our civilization moving along. So how do we work collaboratively? And, you know, we have been, and Jessica's sitting out here, engaged in Highway 37 for quite a while. And it's not, you know, it's not simple. There are, I think, you know, what you've been talking about in terms of the needs that people face right now. And at, you know, on Highway 37, people are sitting in horrible traffic and trying to get from Solano County to work in wealthier communities. And it's a challenging issue. So how do we work collaboratively with Caltrans and with MTC to take into account the wetlands needs in that area, while also thinking about the transportation needs? And I don't have, you know, an easy answer for that, but I think we've they've got to be at the table. Caltrans and MTC have to be at the table, the wastewater treatment plants. In the South Bay Shoreline project, we're dealing with UPRR. It's extremely challenging, and it's very hard to even get them to respond to your emails and phone calls. Just the willingness to like engage in the conversations and think more holistically about these projects. And I think, we have to come at it thinking more holistically, and we've got to ask Caltrans and the wastewater treatment plants and the railroads and others to think more holistically from their end as well. And maybe this is where actually a lot of these regulations set up over the decades can help us out.
It's a good segue to we don't have an easy button here. I think about where I might have tools in my tool belt to use. And again, it's great when we have POTWs and utilities who are willing to kind of come to the table and be forward thinking. We do have our permitting mechanisms. The regional board has been really great at trying to incentivize for the POTWs and the municipalities to start thinking about their infrastructure, their long-term asset management planning. So it's great where we have, from my perspective, a Clean Water Act permit, we can use that tool to start getting them to the table. It's much more difficult for some of our other federal partners, so highways. And I think a lot of it will be driven by local communities and their desire and need for change. And it may start as a transportation project. And then I think we need to make sure that we're at the table to make sure that they are thinking, as Amy said, much more holistically about those projects.
Okay, I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that, I think that the piece that will change the most from my perspective is to be able to match the funds from these multi-benefit approaches, because we're great at planning multi-benefit projects, but the implementation is always the challenge due to the funding sources. Everybody, all the feds, the Clean Water Act here and the transportation over here, never able to match them. I have great admiration for the city of San Pablo, small city, but they're excellent at layering transportation and green infrastructure funding and other kind of funding. And I have seen others try, and it's not that easy. So why not try to structure it from the beginning to line it up that way and kind of have complementary matching apply to 2 grants at the same time or something.
Okay, I'm sorry. I had so many questions that I forgot about the audience. There's such a wealth of knowledge here. So we're going to take a few minutes and open it up to the audience for questions.